Welcome, everybody. You're in the sustainability session. If you're planning to be elsewhere, you should probably stick around at this point, because this will be a better session than what you were headed to. Feel free to sit where you are or come closer. I think I'm mic'd up. But with this size of group, I think the more interactive we can make it, the better. So please do raise your hand, jump in. There's no reason to wait until the end for any questions. Let me first just take stock. How many, maybe you can raise your hand if the primary function in your role is sustainability. Perfect. And how about if your primary function isn't sustainability, but sustainability is one important element of what you do? You interface with sustainability. Excellent. And then what about for folks who are on a digital team, innovation or IT? Okay, a few. And then anyone from the business, so with a sort of operations, engineering, manufacturing, supply chain, procurement. Perfect. So we have a really healthy mix. That's awesome. So sustainability will mean something a little bit different to different folks in the room, and we'll try and paint a complete picture here of how this comes together. My name is Burt Mayer. I'm a product manager at C3 AI. I lead the product team that focuses on energy efficiency and sustainability. This session is going to focus on the intersection of generative AI and sustainability. You will have been hearing a lot about generative AI from Tom and from Nikhil after that. I'm going to make a bold statement that sustainability is the killer use case for generative AI. And I see some skepticism, but over the next, say, 43 minutes, I'm gonna convince you of this as well, because I know this to be true. In the title of this session was ESG and generative AI. Many folks in the room are folks mostly familiar with this term, ESG, environmental social governance. This is a relatively new term that sort of exploded in popularity coming out of COVID. At least I thought it exploded in popularity. I tried to create the same chart also with Taylor Swift, and this just falls to zero on ESG. It turns out people are much more interested in Taylor Swift than ESG. But for the purposes of this meeting, I'm going to be using ESG interchangeably with sustainability. The term ESG has fallen out of favor a little bit in the US. What I mean by this term and by sustainability or by corporate social responsibility is the collection of topics and themes that spans carbon emissions and waste and water, but also diversity and human rights in the supply chain and product safety and a variety of cybersecurity and corruption risk and a variety of other metrics. It's an enormous world that falls under this bucket of sustainability. Around this sort of ESG term emergence is when you start to see, for many companies and in many industries, sustainability was a board level priority forever. But what we saw around maybe 5 years ago was sustainability at more and more companies and in broader and broader sets of industries become a C-suite level priority, a board level topic. And we find that there are generally three elements of that. The board is going to talk about sustainability in the context of three specific, somewhat discrete things. And so it's always important when we talk with clients or in our work with clients that we distinguish between these three things. The first is strategy. This refers to what is the risk to my business associated with climate, or the risk to my supply chain. What is the risk to my business of emerging regulation? What is the risk to my business of changing customer preferences and demands? How do I get out in front of this in a way that benefits me competitively rather than puts me at a disadvantage competitively? Secondly is reporting. Many companies are grappling with this challenge of collecting data from across their organization and publishing these sustainability reports, increasingly also in their annual reports that align to this alphabet soup of acronyms, both voluntary standards and now increasingly regulated standards. You may have heard sort of in the voluntary regime, SASB and TCFD and GRI and CDP, and the list goes on and on. We try and make it as complicated as possible in sustainability. Now, increasingly regulated. So many of our conversations now are about CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, not just with European clients, but also with American clients that are subject to CSRD rules. Also, SEC making announcements today, ISSB in many countries. So the reporting challenge, which is really a data management challenge, is also a board level priority. And then thirdly, there's the little task of how do we actually go and achieve these public commitments that we made, right? Somebody in the board meeting says, hey, remember 3 or 4 years ago, we said that we were going to be 70% lower in our scope 1, scope 2 emissions, or we were going to be 50% lower in our upstream scope 3 emissions. Like, how are we actually doing on that, right? How are we going to achieve that? So that's an operational challenge. By the way, each of these 3 challenges plays into the new CSRD requirements. And within CSRD, there are quantitative and qualitative metrics that need to be disclosed, including calculation of scope 3 emissions and action plans to reduce carbon emissions against your targets. And then there's this concept of a double materiality assessment. We won't go too deep into stakeholder materiality and financial materiality, but this is essentially some treatment of the risks and opportunities facing the business that now have to be disclosed. Most organizations were doing this anyway with consultancies, with advisors, but now they're mandated by law to include this strategic assessment within their sustainability report, and we believe that this is a great use case for generative AI. C3 started doing sustainability. Many folks, how many, show of hands? Because even when I should say before, when I do this in C3 groups, most folks don't know this, but how many people knew that the C in C3 stands for or stood for carbon? Okay, a few people. So C3 was founded in 2009 by Tom Siebel as an energy efficiency and carbon analytics software company. And all of our original set of customers were power utilities and large energy users. And we did big data for the purposes of scope 1, scope 2 mitigation, cap and trade, buildings energy efficiency, a variety of other related use cases. Obviously now you'll have seen we're doing many more things in federal and defense and supply chain, predictive maintenance and process optimization, but our heritage is in sustainability. And today when we talk with sustainability teams, we try to identify which of those 3 challenges are we trying to solve together. And we've aligned those to 3 specific technologies, 3 modules that we've developed. One, ESG strategy and risk. This relates to materiality, competitive benchmarking, strategy, understanding what is the sentiment, what are the expectations of my customers and my investors, and how am I talking about issues relative to my competitors. The second is data management and reporting. How do I pull together all of this data from my ERP systems, my human resources management systems, my utility billing systems, my environment, health, and safety systems? It goes on and on and on. How do I navigate this problem of reporting out when I have great data in South America and poor data in APAC against different sets of metrics? And by the way, I think about my business in the context of geographies, but also we've been doing M&A and we have these different legal entities and we have different business functions, and how do I aggregate the data and slice and dice it in different ways in all of these different contexts? And then the third is emissions management. That's how do I calculate my scope 3 emissions without 100 Excel spreadsheets? And then how do I plan out my progress against decarbonization targets? By the way, in each of these, we believe is an analytics problem, is an AI problem. So for example, in emissions management, when we work on scope 3 emissions with customers, we're using AI to map your ERP data, your purchase orders, to emission factors. So we can automate the baselining, the calculation of those emissions. And then as you want to progress from spend-based emission factors to higher quality emission factors like industry averages, using natural language processing and increasingly generative AI to ensure that we're calculating the emissions in the appropriate or highest quality way without taking a full-time equivalent from the sustainability team, which is already understaffed to do that. Today I want to focus primarily on the ESG strategy and risk portion. So this is where we get into double materiality. I encourage anyone who has a particular interest in scope 3 emissions or decarbonization or has an interest in reporting and data management generally, please chat with myself or with Justin or with Jessica. We're all on the sustainability team at C3. and we'd be happy to share how we use AI, how we solve these problems with a variety of different customers. But because this conference has such a focus on generative AI, and I already made this promise to you that I'm going to convince you that sustainability is the best generative AI use case, I want to focus with you on strategy and risk. Why do we care about ESG strategy and risk? Like, what does that mean, and why is it important for a business? And not to pick on these three companies, who are most of which are attendees here this week. Hopefully, I'm not offending anyone in the room. And also, these three brands now today have some of the most mature sustainability organizations in the world. But these three logos represent organizations which suffered significant either brand destructive value, or in the case of Exxon, a shareholder rebellion, by virtue of an ESG topic that caught them off guard. And you can find hundreds of examples of this, and some of which are sort of surprise things, but a door gets ripped off a Boeing jet. What I like about these three examples are these are each places: Walmart and employee treatment, Apple and supply chain human rights, Exxon and climate policies. These are three examples where if they had been paying attention to the right publicly available data, they could have mitigated this risk. Right? The writing was on the wall. The sentiment was in the public sphere well before they suffered brand damage that then they had to invest order of hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars to remedy over years. So if that's why it's important, why is it hard to do that? Why is it hard for someone like an Apple or a Walmart to get out in front of these things? Well, the simple answer is that it's not just one or two organizations that you need to pay attention to. And it's not just one or two publications that you can read and then you understand your expectations. But in fact, what we see is that for every one of the important stakeholders in the sphere of an organization, and by that I mean investors, I mean customers, I mean suppliers, I mean local communities, NGOs, they are communicating what they care about, either in news media or social media, in investor proxy guidelines, in annual reports. But the task of understanding all of that material is simply not possible, even for a sustainability team the size of Apple's or Walmart's or Exxon's. If you look just at investors, and we did this exercise with a large energy company I'll tell you about, just for investors, we may be looking at 26,000 pages of text per year. And when companies do try to think strategically and get out in front of understanding what do my investors care about, what do my local communities care about, the way that they address this is through a materiality assessment project with a consultancy where they pay some number of hundreds of thousands of dollars, they receive back some analysis, and then they sit on that analysis for 2 years and then they run it again. And by the time the determination was made of stakeholder materiality, it's already stale and out of date. So we've established that it's really important for particularly large global organizations to stay out in front of the shifting concerns and expectations that represent risks and opportunities for their businesses. This is a board-level priority. It's nearly impossible to do manually in a way that doesn't result in high costs and stale insights. So this brings us to generative AI. Before I tell you about how C3, from a technology standpoint, approaches this problem, I want to tell you a case study. One of our customers, who you'll have heard some about in the main stage sessions, is Baker Hughes. We did a project with Baker Hughes starting about a year ago, where they came to us with exactly this problem. Every 2 years-ish, we do a materiality assessment. We hire a consultancy. They tell us what we need to pay attention to. They care deeply about what do our local communities expect from us. How are we being treated in the news media? How are our competitors talking about sustainability topics different than we are? And what does that mean in terms of the competitive advantages and disadvantages that we face in the market? So they came to us and said, is there a better way? And what we did was we looked at the problem, which looks like immense amounts of publicly available unstructured data, specific questions, strategic queries, and the need to scale this broadly and automate that sort of analysis. And that sounds a lot to us like a generative AI use case, right? This is exactly what generative AI is good for, is taking enormous volumes of unstructured data and pulling signal out of that noise in order to guide some value-add action. So this is Baker Hughes, a huge company. They face this challenge of wanting to look broadly across all of sustainability, wanting to look broadly across investors, customers, suppliers, employees, local communities, news media, social media, an impossible amount of data. What we did in, I think this was order of 9 weeks, was we took 3,500 stakeholder documents, so things that look like investor engagement guides, sustainability reports, annual reports, competitor documents, press releases and news, blog posts from NGOs, like a larger set of documents than their advisory partner would have looked at in a materiality assessment. And we applied natural language processing and generative AI to query what's important, what do these organizations care about as relates to your business. What does that mean for you in terms of what you should be reporting on, what you should be tracking, what you should be communicating to your marketing department, to your strategy department, to your finance department? And obviously, it's almost not fair comparing this to the manual exercise of reading these documents and preparing a 200-page slide deck, right? You're looking at 99.9% faster, right? And you're looking at 500x more frequent insights. What this represents for them is not just bringing the capability of doing sustainability strategy in-house, but it's being able to look way broader than they did before. Instead of just a couple investors, a couple customers, they're looking at all the investors and all of the customers. And instead of every 2 years you get a snapshot of how it changed, it's like daily or weekly. And what that means is that now you can get out in front of things as they're shifting. That can mean what shifts can look like is that an NGO or a nonprofit is talking about their advocacy for a new environmental regulation. Right? A local community in which this company is operating has maybe a local newspaper, has an online blog for community issues, is talking about some concern with your operations that maybe you wouldn't have picked up on immediately. It can look like a shift in the way that your competitors are starting to talk about how they treat a certain sustainability topic. I'm going to pause there. By the way, this work that we did with Baker Hughes recently won an award as well, a Constellation Supernova Award, for recognition for a novel use of AI to solve a really important and challenging problem. I'll pause there. I want to answer the question, how do we do that? Like, why is C3 the right person to do stakeholder materiality assessments? But before I do, I'll ask to take stock. Does that make sense for the folks who are not necessarily focused day-to-day on sustainability? Does this concept of strategy and paying attention to your stakeholders, does that resonate? I'm seeing some nods. Any questions about that work that we did with Baker Hughes? Yeah?
On the couple slides before, you had 9 months to complete.
9 weeks.
So 9 weeks. This is the AI process, right?
Yeah.
Well, that seems like quite a long time
Yeah.
considering it's Gen AI and retrieval stuff.
Yeah. That's a great question. The question is, why did it take you 9 weeks? Which, bold question for a project used to be 6 months and how do I please you? The reason why it takes 9 weeks and it's not instantaneous is that the customer comes to us. Baker Hughes says, we care about these specific organizations, these NGOs and nonprofits and customers and investors. C3 establishes web scraping pipelines. So we go and figure out, where do those organizations speak online? And then we establish the infrastructure to go and pull all the data off of those websites every day or every week. So we've customized for that customer the ability to pull exactly the information that is specific to them and their stakeholders. The other reason, so that's one, is that we've tailored this to their stakeholders. The second is that large organizations sometimes have specific definitions of these ESG topics. What's relevant for climate or biodiversity for an energy company is going to be very different than for a consumer packaged goods company or an agriculture company. And so our data scientists will take the time, along with our project teams, to work with the customer to understand what are the specific, how do you understand these sustainability issues? And what are the specific types of insights do you look for today when you're reading news media or reading competitor reports? And then we have the ability to tune all that you heard about the retrieval augmented generative AI and the LLMs, we tune the machine learning approach specific to what is meaningful to this customer in terms of sustainability risks. I will say one of the reasons why we feel that this use case is really well suited to C3 AI and to generative AI. One is it's massive amounts of unstructured data that you need to pull signal out of noise. Two, it's really strategic, it's high value. But three is we can do it relatively quickly. So this was 9 weeks because it was actually fairly broad, but we can go even faster in a lot of circumstances. And when you compare to a project where we're trying to map your supply chain or we're trying to predict failures in a population of turbines, this is actually one of the sort of fastest AI deployments that C3 knows of or is able to deliver because it's all data that C3 brings to bear for the customer. It doesn't require the involvement of the customer IT team. It doesn't require a solution architect to sit on the ground and talk about how do we want to do interconnectivity. So this is a way very quickly to get to high value strategic insights. Did that answer your question about 9 weeks? Okay. Yes.
Because one of the impending risks that's coming up is the corporate sustainability due diligence directive implementation in Europe.
Yeah.
That recently failed to get to a commission vote, but it's coming, right? It's going to change, it's going to evolve, it's going to come. And very soon, it's not only going to be a question of, things that I should be doing that could get me, or things that I don't know that could get me,
Yeah.
if I don't know them, like the example that you given, but more and more it's going to become a question of, if I'm not doing it, I'm not compliant,
Yeah.
right? And so that whole portion of how do we become compliant, how do we go in and check, because, some of the, what that new sustainability directive does is it forces you to look at, multiple levels of supplier policing.
Yeah.
And, throughout your whole supply chain, like the example that I think you said that was an Apple problem.
Yeah. Yep.
And in this case, it's an Apple problem that probably just came to light and that they then had to deal with the
Yeah.
social impact of that. But in this case, then there's a legal implication.
Yeah.
There's a legal implication. There's actual penalties that have to,
Yeah.
that will ensue. And penalties that ensue are more than just what the impact is from, the customers are upset with me. It's the, I now have to pay fines.
Absolutely.
I'm not compliant. How are you guys tackling CS-triple-D in Europe for your customers? Is that a big area that you've now added to your umbrella under ESG?
Yeah. It's something we're exploring. I don't think we've worked specifically on a CS-triple-D project with a customer yet, but one thing we're very interested in is how do you scale a similar type of insight, but maybe more compliance-oriented, up to tier 1, tier 2, tier N suppliers. And we have a few ways that we approach similar types of problems. I will also caveat that as we get into specifically compliance issues, C3, I'm waiting, there'll be a lawyer who pops in the door if I don't say that C3 does not take on responsibility for legal compliance with regulatory. And oftentimes, this software will be a support to a team that is responsible ultimately for certifying compliance. But the ways in which we think about sort of due diligence up a supply chain are fewfold. One is we've partnered with a data provider called ESG Book that provides us with large volumes of ESG data about large companies around the world that they scrape themselves from disclosures and sustainability reports and blog posts, et cetera. And so we can already from day one map your supply base to this data and understand who's overperformers, underperformers from a sort of quantitative ESG perspective. And then secondly, we can point this sort of web scraping, natural language processing, sentiment analysis, generative AI approach towards one of the benefits of AI here is that it can scale near infinitely across a broader range of organizations. So where this doesn't get you all the way to full legal compliance is that the data that feeds into this machine learning is publicly available data. And it may well be that sources of non-compliance in the supply chain may not exist anywhere in the public sphere, and their models will not pick up on them. But we can tune the prompts of the generative AI models, say they're the natural language processing, what we're retrieving, to look more specifically at certain types of risks in the supply chain, or more specifically at the types of insights that will be applicable and relevant in a CS-triple-D disclosure initiative. I sort of get at the answer of the...
Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking more of is And so at some point, whenever that legislation comes
Yeah.
to life, we're going to have to react to it. And as part of reacting to it, for example, you may have, an example would be, I need to scour, 15,000 supplier contracts to understand, do I have language? Do I have, can I enforce? Because some of them are really historical from times when, and have evergreen clauses that maybe we completely missed.
Yeah.
The child labor law, being a part of it. So, you almost have to scour your database and all your contracts and say, where do I have risks so that I can then respond and go back and make sure that I negotiate that or address my supplier base or all of the level of risk that it's going to eventually bring. And so it'll be an interesting dynamic.
It's going to be hugely important that teams both put into place the expertise and the technology that allows them to do that analysis. And I'll show you in a demo here in a minute what that can look like, that sort of analysis. But also, I can say that increasingly we're talking with customers or working with customers on use cases that are quite similar. So an example is an apparel manufacturer that has written documents from their suppliers about the nature of the materials that are being provided. And they want to know what fraction of my materials are certified organic or recycled or recyclable. So it's not legal contracts, but it's similarly, we're swimming in a mess of this contractual supplier data, and we got to understand where do we stand and what are our risks. So that's a perfect use case. Talk a little bit about how are we doing this? Why is you're at an enterprise AI and analytics company we're talking to you about sustainability? How are we using all of the technology that you've heard about over the last day for this purpose? Well, you will have heard if you were in Nikhil's deep dive session earlier about how C3 thinks about generative AI. It's the exact same in this case. We use any large language model, depending on the customer's preference, depending on what is giving us the best performance for this particular problem. But the real special sauce, the piece that our sustainability data scientists focus on, is how do we retrieve the relevant and applicable information from that sea of text to answer the question. Right? If you think about hundreds of thousands of documents from all of your stakeholders about all of these sustainability issues, I have a specific question. What is my risk that I'm exposed to related to biodiversity amongst my suppliers? Right? The C3 AI domain models in this case, or the retrieval models, are identifying which passages within which documents are talking about biodiversity. And that's non-trivial because maybe they're talking about biodiversity without using the word biodiversity. You can't just control find. And then they're figuring out which of those passages is referring to something that looks like a risk in the way that your business thinks about a risk. And then it's taking that much smaller set of documents that seems to be applicable to your query, and it's feeding it to the large language model only for the purpose, at the last step, of summarizing back into natural language the answer to your question. What are the risks that I'm exposed to? The value of using generative AI within this world of strategy and risk management, opportunity identification, double materiality assessment is actually pretty broad. So one is the sort of the materiality assessment we've been talking about and the risk assessment, but another is your sort of classic natural language-based search and chat, right? Someone on the sustainability team or someone in another team might have a question on a given day like, what is our human rights in the supply chain policy internally? And rather than going and needing to find the PDF document that lives in some system, they can query any of the internal ESG policies. So that looks a lot like some of the other use cases we would have heard about. But also a question like, how am I performing relative to my competitor on this issue? Or more challenging to answer, how am I talking about this issue relative to my competitor? Or how am I talking about this issue relative to how this key investor or this key customer talks about this sustainability issue, like human rights in the supply chain or cybersecurity or climate? And then lastly, increasingly, we've been working with customers on this idea of automated questionnaire response, which is I, as a sustainability leader, am inundated with questionnaires from investors, from ratings agencies, from customers who want to understand their sustainability procurement. Why can't I use, right, all of the answers live in my source systems. They live in my internal ESG policies. We can use generative AI to automate the first draft of the responses to those questions. So these are all different use cases for generative AI, but all of them at the end of the day come back to massive volumes of text data, a broad variety of different themes and topics within sustainability, and a broad variety of different questions and risks that you might want to probe. That's what makes this a near impossible task manually and a near perfect challenge for AI. I'm going to show you this screen in the software here in just a second, but one of the challenges that we get when we talk about generative AI and sustainability is I can't just take your model's word for it. You say that we have a human rights in the supply chain risk, you're going to have to prove that to me before I go and take an action on that. So anywhere in the C3 application, we're going to utilize an end-to-end auditability to show you from the synthesis, the answer, what's the rationale for that? Let's explain why we answered that way. Let's tie that to individual documents, and not just individual documents, but individual sentences and paragraphs within those documents, and then give you the opportunity to tell the system that actually the model's understanding of that document was not correct. That the sentence that the model determined meant that you have a biodiversity risk. I, as a user, need to have the ability to say, no, that's actually not a risk to me, and then have that feedback in automatically. So almost more important than the answer is the explanation. Because what we find is without the explanation, no one is going to take action, is going to go and modify their strategy or act on the risks and opportunities that are exposed through this. I'm going to pull up some software to show you what this looks and feels like. We have about 10, 12 minutes left. I set out with an ambitious objective to prove to you that sustainability is the perfect generative AI use case. How am I doing on that so far? 6 out of 10, a few thumbs up. I'll take it. I have learned over the years that one of the least sustainable things I can do is stand in the way of happy hour. So we're going to be efficient. And please do jump in if any questions as I show you some software here. As I mentioned before, C3 does a broad variety of things in sustainability. I'm not going to have time to show you how we treat AI for Scope 3 emissions, though hopefully you've had a chance to see our supply chain applications. We're using the same underlying supply chain capabilities in Digital Twin for Scope 3 automation. Really, we think of Scope 3 as a supply chain challenge, an analytics challenge. Similarly, if you're interested in ESG data management reporting, we're happy to share that with you in the marketplace tomorrow, or we'll give you our cards and happy to chat anytime. Today, I want to chat just very specifically about some of these use cases we've been talking about. And I'm going to show you just a few screens here that relate to this idea of AI automated materiality analysis and risk and opportunity assessment that does not, today, we feel like is an important and high-value input into a CSRD double materiality analysis and sort of empowers teams to do this for themselves. On this first screen, I'm showing you a traditional materiality matrix. So some sustainability folks in the room will be familiar with this kind of quadrant view of business impact and stakeholder materiality score. Generally, these dots for different sustainability topics, these are being plotted and then continuously moving based on the documents that we're scraping online from a customer stakeholders. And you see for each of these issues, I'll zoom in a little bit here, like greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, biodiversity, employee engagement, we have this concept of a 0 to 100 score that tells us which of these things is more material to is more important to my stakeholders. And then within each of these issues, how do my different stakeholders care about it? And it's actually quite insightful. It's always interesting with customers for them to see how that breakdown happens. It turns out that water issues are being discussed prominently, for example, by NGOs that they care about, but not so much by competitors or not so much by investors, and similarly with other issues. We might identify here that greenhouse gas emissions is a really high materiality score. That means that the organizations that we're pointing our AI at are picking up on a lot of discussion about the importance of greenhouse gas emissions to those organizations, particularly in the context of the corporations that they interface with. I want to deep dive into that. I want to understand not just what is material, but how is that shifting over time, and what specifically is important within that topic. So here we have this view. At the top, these are key performance indicators showing how many issues I'm tracking and generally what's the materiality of environmental versus social and governance. But below this, we can see a more visual view of the trends over time associated with each of these different sustainability topics. Glowing bright blue means that there's a lot of discussion among your stakeholders about that topic, and more dim, like business ethics. In this case, there are very few documents within those hundreds of thousands or millions that we're processing that are talking about this issue of business ethics. And by the way, business ethics is a good example of why you can't just do Control F, right? And we get the question like, why can't I just set a Google alert for business ethics, and then I know if people are talking about business ethics? The answer is because a lot of the time people are talking about business ethics, they're not using the term business ethics. What can be really interesting is when these things shift over time. And a good example of that is we saw maybe 18 months ago, all of a sudden biodiversity, which went from looking like business ethics, started to look more like greenhouse gas emissions. And you can't see it here in this particular data set, but that caught a lot of companies off guard. This robust dialogue around biodiversity emerged very quickly. I think even more interestingly than this sort of visual heat map view, is we're using generative AI to take those documents that I told you the retrieval models have indicated are applicable to, say, climate change or social and financial inclusion, and to your stakeholders, and we're summarizing what is it that they're talking about. That's the most important thing. Like, what is the relevance of these themes to the stakeholders? And as I showed you on that slide, what are the sources, right? Where did that come from? So you see citations in the main text here that tie to individual documents, individual excerpts, so that I can tie back and I can justify for myself why is it that the generative AI is doing this. And I think here, by default, when we land on this page, it's showing me all of the issues and all of the stakeholder groups, but I can easily filter down over a certain time range if I want to see just in the last 6 months what's really material to these stakeholders. I can filter to say a specific sustainability topic, like maybe greenhouse gas emissions. I can filter to a specific stakeholder group, like investors or suppliers or NGOs, or a specific stakeholder name, if I wanted to look at just a specific organization or a specific document type, like investor reports, whatever, and it'll process a new query. And then I can tie it back to individual excerpts. So, for example, right, maybe I see a report from a competitor in the form of a press release that I want to go and probe because the model said it has a high materiality, and I can take a look at what the excerpt was, and I can trace it back to a specific document, to a specific publication. So this is what, at a really high level, an AI-founded materiality analysis looks like, that might update on it on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, and also alert to the right people within the organization when things seem to be changing. I want to show you one more thing before we go to more Q&A, and that's a risk and opportunity assessment. This, depending on the organization, they may think about risk within the context of materiality. We worked with a customer that has a separate risk analytics process that they do that feeds into an enterprise risk management structure and analysis that's done for the board on an annual basis. And what they were interested in is how can we use generative AI to start to automate some of that risk analysis that's today done outside of our organization by consultants and infrequently and on a small set of documents. And what made this a really interesting challenge, I think, and made it particularly interesting, important in terms of bringing generative AI to bear, is that they may want in a given time to select certain specific ESG or sustainability topics, and then also to consider risk or opportunity in a different way. So I got to refresh my screen here. Give me 1 second. So for example, I may want to be thinking about risk in terms of regulatory risk for a certain analysis, but then I also may want to be thinking about the risk of shifting customer demand, or the risk of like physical climate risk on my operations. And so what that means is that on an assessment by assessment basis, I have the ability here to weight, do I want to focus more on commercial impact risk or societal impact or operational impact? Do I want to focus on risks that have been relevant in the past versus risks that are being mentioned in these documents as being something that is potentially concerning in the future tense, right? And when I think about opportunities, are these opportunities because they're being mentioned in the context of being huge from a market size perspective, or are they opportunities because they're being mentioned in the context of ecosystems of partners and vendors, and so that's a more strategic a partnership-related opportunity. This is the kind of analysis that is going to mean that McKinsey charges you another $1 million every time you want to change one of these weights. And I can say that as I'm a recovering BCG consultant myself. But the ability to do this with generative AI and to generate an assessment that looks like this, that has, say, a set of sustainability topics like biodiversity and climate, a high-level risk assessment, medium, high, and then the ability to click down into any one of those dimensions. So I've selected risk impact, I select biodiversity or climate. Let's see if I can, and it should populate here a generative AI natural language summary of what is the model seeing as my risks. So here I've clicked into biodiversity, and it's going to, for each of those lenses, tell me what the model is determining as my commercial impact, my issue interdependency, my operational impact, regulatory impact, societal impact, similarly with risk likelihood, with opportunity. This is a framework that we've determined is flexible and can be applied broadly across industries, but different customers want to think about risks and opportunities in different ways, and this framework is flexible to accommodate that. And then similarly can tie back to individual sources, to individual documents. We can see the excerpts which were identified by the model as being applicable. And then we have the ability actually to correct these risk assessments, to say, actually, the model determined this is medium low, but I believe that this is high for my business, or medium high. And then that'll feed back in so that the model learns over time what's meaningful to your business in terms of risks or opportunities. This is, to our knowledge, a really novel application of natural language processing and generative AI to support large organizations in staying closer, ultimately staying closer to the organizations that exist around them that drive many of the risks and opportunities and competitive concerns and strategic concerns that are the top priority of CSOs and boards, and today are a near impossible problem to solve in a rigorous automated way. So we think this is a relatively new use case for us, but something that we see significant interest in, partially driven by double materiality requirements in CSRD, but more so because it is such a step change versus the way that organizations today are treating this challenge of engaging with stakeholders. I'm going to stop there. I've showed you now a bunch of software. I've showed you how we partnered with one customer specifically in energy and energy services. Talked to you about how we bring our technology and apply it to this problem within sustainability. Again, I'll remind you, we're doing data management pieces where a lot of the work is in kind of taxonomies and hierarchies and establishing digital twins for your corporate reporting. And happy to talk about any of those topics, but wanted to make sure that I had the opportunity to try and convince you that more than any of the other topics, you go to the defense session and the predictive maintenance session, this is the one. This is the killer. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks for attending. Any questions that I can answer? Yeah.
For the big Hughes example, did you ever go in after the fact and look at their internal documents to see how they mapped up against you?
Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, they were very clear. He was asking about, did we ever go back and determine how did we do, basically, versus what the exercises that they had done. They partnered with an advisory firm, not KPMG, to do a materiality assessment. And they were very clear with us when we kicked off the project, we're not going to show you what this other firm determined. And part of the way that they gauged success for the project was what was the overlap. And it was something like 85% overlap in the determination of material issues, which they loved because they felt like we were identifying things that their partner had not. And they saw a benefit in this approach actually that we had not originally envisioned when we designed this and brought it to market, which was this idea of bias. And they were very cognizant of the ability of the AI models to discern materiality and stakeholder importance in a way that's more divorced from the perspectives of the individual 3 or 4 consultants which were assigned to that project. And so they saw this as and obviously large language models have their own sets of biases, but they saw this as a way to get a more unbiased perspective because of not having humans in the loop. Ultimately, we saw it had extremely high overlap, and that gave them the confidence to then say, let's go do this with more stakeholders, more topics, make this bigger and bigger. Yeah, other questions? Awesome. Well, yeah. Thank you for that question because we get the value question often, and it's a little bit. I think across the board in sustainability, it's a little bit trickier to quantify the value than in Jessica and I in sustainability product. We're so envious of our colleagues in predictive maintenance who can just say, we saved you an equipment failure that's worth $1 million. I think the way we often quantify value and make a business case with our customers is the labor allocation. So you previously spent $500,000 every 18 months on a consultancy. It's going to cost you significantly less than that to put this into practice, and this is 2 orders of magnitude more powerful and effective for you. So saying the savings on advisory services is one lever. The ability to reallocate a small sustainability team to higher value, higher priority tasks. I think one of the biggest value levers is exemplified by like an insight that Baker Hughes found when they did this, which was one of their smaller customers that didn't have a dedicated account exec had published something online about a new priority that they had in sustainability. And that was flagged by the model as something that Baker Hughes should pay attention to, such that somebody could send an email to somebody of like, we need to go have a conversation with this customer about how we need to be their trusted partner to achieve this new commitment that they've made in the form of some blog post hidden somewhere on their website. So the real value, I think, bigger than saving money on a consulting project or even reallocating the internal labor, is in the ability to manage this sort of minefield of shifting stakeholder expectations in a way that is revenue accretive and competitively differentiating.
This use case is doing a deep dive into one company and getting their ESG strategy and risk assessment done. What if you work for an asset manager like I do?
Yeah.
And you're investing in 100 companies in a fund.
Yeah.
And you have to look at 100 companies, not just one company.
Yeah.
That seems like that's a very different use case. How would you solve that one?
In some ways different, and in other ways I think, so I should say first, we haven't done that use case yet. So, would love to dive deeper into what that could look like. But as you scale this out and the problem seemingly gets bigger and bigger, you have more companies, that actually, I think, makes the ROI or the value proposition more compelling. The challenge, the way that this needs to get set up to be meaningful is identifying who are the stakeholders, what are the organizations that are relevant to risk in your portfolio, and what are some examples of those risks. And then once we teach the model what that means, what that looks like, and we use specific excerpts, labels that we feed into these models, then it's quite easy for us to scale that across 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 companies. Part of the joy of this approach is that it can be automated across millions of websites, millions of documents. We have deliberately started from the corporate side rather than the asset management side, but I think that there's potentially a lot of value there. Anything? Well, if no other questions, I'm in the AI marketplace for the rest of the week with my colleague Jessica. We're very happy to chat about anything and everything. Ask us for our cards as well. This is something that we're really passionate about. We feel like, if you hadn't noticed, that AI is a really strong match for this particular topic, and would love to continue the conversation with you. Otherwise, have a great time in Boca and enjoy the sessions tomorrow.